It's been an exciting day. I've been challenged and encouraged by what we've done through today. This afternoon, we're going to be turning our attention to other religious freedom issues around Australia. The past 12 months have been one of the busiest periods ever for religious freedom. Now, we spent an hour in the last two talks thinking about one of the pieces of legislation we're dealing with. We've only got 14 more pieces of legislation to make our way through, so we'll be fine. You think I'm joking. The number of issues we're dealing with have been staggering. At the federal level, next slide please. We've had the Religious Discrimination Bill and the Sex Discrimination Act with faith-based schools, the Productivity Commission review into philanthropy, the Australian Human Rights Commission Costs Protection Bill, a potential human rights charter, misinformation and disinformation legislation, and various forms of religious vilification laws. In New South Wales, we've had conversion practices legislation, the Equality Bill, anti-discrimination review has started, and we expect to hear more about that fairly soon too. In Queensland, the proposed anti-discrimination rewrite, which got canned, but currently we are dealing with the Respect at Work Bill. Then in Tasmania, has had conversations about conversion therapy proposals. In South Australia, a Greens MP is planning to introduce legislation removing religious exemptions on employment. In Western Australia, the Attorney-General has begun work on conversion practices legislation, and that's not everything that's going on. That's not counting New South Wales and Tasmanian elections that we've already seen, and planning for Queensland, ACT, Northern Territory, Western Australian and federal elections in the next few months. But it's been constant. But through it all, God has been good. Our supporters have been steadfast. The heads of faith have been coordinated and responsive, and we've made gains. Now, if you were here last year, we mapped out the issues that we were facing in religious freedom, and we laid out our plans. And that meant mobilising the average person in the pew. Sorry, not to be too angry, in the seat. Equipping them to speak to their local politicians in a gentle but effective way. And we proposed two main strategies: candidate forums and directly contacting MPs. And we'll talk about them in more detail later, but the important thing to note about our strategies is they've worked. In New South Wales, the government recently passed a conversion practices bill with explicit protections for families and faith communities and medical practitioners. By no means perfect. There are significant problems with this bill, but it's miles better than where we started and miles better than the legislation of Victoria. Following that, we've engaged with Alex Greenwich's Equality Bill, and due to our pressure and pressure from many others, the government has delayed that bill time and time again as they try to figure out what they're going to do with it. This is the first time in New South Wales that any government of any party has said no to Mr. Greenwich on his hyper-aggressive agenda. In Queensland, the government introduced anti-discrimination legislation that would have stripped faith communities of their rights to employ based on faith. But faith communities came together quickly, supported by us, and the government have withdrawn that bill. They've replaced it with something far less ambitious, which has its own significant problems again, but again, it is a massive improvement. And federally, the Australian Law Reform Commission, as we've already heard, released a report calling for faith-based schools to have their rights completely stripped away from them. Now, the government has had every opportunity to legislate that report. The Greens have told them they will pass it, but they haven't. Now, it's completely unacceptable, as we've heard over the past hour, that this bill hasn't been dealt with. But the fact that bad legislation hasn't been forced through is in itself a victory. The government has had to pause and think. And just last week, the federal government announced that they would not support the Productivity Commission's recommendations to strip tax deductibility from school building funds and religious education in government schools. Now, none of these are unqualified successes. But considering where we were heading 2 years ago, these are successes where we were expecting to just keep losing. I remember a meeting almost 2 years ago when we were talking about our strategy for New South Wales conversion therapy, and one seasoned campaigner told me, "You're going to get monstered. The progressive left have the government captured. They will not listen to you." But they did. Faith communities have come together and coordinated our voices. The churches of New South Wales ran candidate forums in over a third of electorates and in almost every single marginal one. All faiths came together to mobilise our people to write to their MP and have meetings with them, and governments are starting to listen. So let's take the next little while to have a look at where we are today and think about where we're going in the future. We've already heard about the religious discrimination bill, but there is a lot more on the agenda, as we said. So for each, we are actually going to walk through all those bits of legislation I just mentioned briefly, and for each one, we're going to look at where we are, what we have done, and where we're going. And there is a lot, and we've just had lunch. So that's why we had the coffee cart, by the way. Right. Productivity Commission. In February last year, the Treasurer asked the Productivity Commission to investigate how to increase philanthropic giving. It was a pretty straightforward task. However, in November last year, the Commission released its draft report, and the recommendations went far beyond the terms of reference by directly targeting religion. The Commission recommended massively extending tax deductibility for almost every form of non-profit, with the explicit exemption of religion. This means giving tax deductibility to organisations who expressly attack religion, but not giving tax deductibility to those organisations that promote and protect it. In addition, the Commission recommended the removal of 2 existing categories of tax deductibility. Both of them were religious. The first was religious education in government schools, called RIGS, and that's school scripture, SRE, RI, for those in New South Wales and Queensland. The second was school building funds, were used by both public and private schools to build facilities to educate our next generation, and predominantly used in the private space, and again, predominantly used in faith-based schools. Finally, the Productivity Commission recommended the removal of the basic religious category. This category basically says that small religious bodies don't fall under the authority of the Australian Charities and Non-Profits Commission, the ACNC. And the reason it was created was when the ACNC was formed, it was given very sweeping authority over charities, including the ability to remove their executive and replace them. And the government realised that if the ACNC had power over churches, they literally could replace the minister with their own choice of minister. So the government created this exemption. And, of course, the Productivity Commission recommended that this exemption should be removed. They argued that religions should have the same level of compliance as everyone else. But the simple fact is, it would give the ACNC sweeping powers into the local church. It arguably even remove an archbishop. That is an unprecedented intervention of government into faith. Not surprisingly, we responded forcefully. Supported faith leaders as they wrote their submissions, and we wrote a sizable submission ourselves. Our submission particularly focused on highlighting the systematic anti-religion nature of the Productivity Commission's recommendations. And we supported sustained engagement with the government by many groups, with the federal government explaining to them the implications of these recommendations. And when the draft report came out, the government made a point of saying, these aren't our policies. This is the Productivity Commission's recommendations, and they did some effort in distancing themselves. which was encouraging. Well, last month, the Commission's final report came out, and I can encouraged and happy to say that they ignored every single one of our recommendations, and they just made exactly the same recommendations they made previously. It's very disappointing that we were completely ignored, but the encouraging thing is that the government still is listening. Once again, they've distanced themselves from the recommendations, highlighting that this was only the Commission's position. They've also explicitly ruled out removing tax deductibility on school building funds and on religious education in government schools. That's a good start, but we're not done. We still wait to hear their position on tax deductibility in general and, of course, in the basic religious category exemptions. The government very clearly knows our position, so we're waiting to hear more and hear what they're saying about this. The important thing on this to remember is that there is a long road in between a Productivity Commission report and government legislation. There are plenty of wrecked Productivity Commission reports still lying on the ground 10 years later after being released that haven't made it into government policy. But we need to keep an eye on this, and we need to keep pressure on it so that no government in the future goes, oh, that's a good idea. I might be picking that one up. I think it's unlikely that they'll pick this fight, 5 months before an election? So this is a watch this space kind of issue. Okay, Human Rights Commission Costs Protection Bill. Hands up if you actually had heard of this one. Yeah, this is an obscure issue that very few of you had heard about, but it comes with massive implications. The bill, in general, was created to remove some of the barriers that made sexual harassment claims difficult to progress. In sexual harassment, the argument is that big, rich companies can throw lots of money into defending those claims, and they can threaten the applicant with pursuing costs. And even if a case is proved out of 9 out of 10 points, on the 10th point that failed, the big, rich company could start suing the person for their costs on that. So the situation would be, the argument goes, that a woman who's been harassed in her job, puts in a sexual harassment claim, gets told by the company, well, yeah, you can do that, but you know if you don't win on every single claim, we are coming after you for millions of dollars of costs. What do you want to do about that? You want to take our settlement? So the legislation was intended to change that power imbalance. But what it does is it changes it so that the applicant will never have to pay the costs of the defending organisation, and the defendant has to pay the applicant's costs even if only a small part of the claim is successful. I don't know if this is the right balance in sexual harassment legislation, but the problem is the legislation wasn't limited to sexual harassment. This rebalancing applies to all discrimination claims in the federal court, which risks a wide range of unintended consequences. The most obvious is that it allows activists to weaponise the federal court system without ever having to face consequences. Self-funded complainants can launch cases with almost no chance of success and incurring massive costs to the organisation who's having to defend, the church, the school, the religious organisation, and the activists know they never have to pay a cent whatever happens. You can grind your opposition down just by throwing baseless claims. So, we helped faith organisations with their submissions, and we made a submission of our own. And we were invited to testify in front of the parliamentary committee. And the committee the committee tabled its report earlier this year, and that report quoted freedom for faith a lot. In fact, I was really pleased to see whether or not they accepted it. The committee accurately reflected our concerns in their report. We were heard. Now, the report was tabled in February, and the government doesn't seem to have done anything since with the report. So I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if it's on the legislative agenda for the rest of the year. We don't know what's the fight coming, but our voice has been heard, we have made our point, and we're going to be watching this bill. Hopefully it's stalled and we can pick it up and find a better rebalancing of this legislation under the next government. Okay, how are we feeling? Human Rights Charter. The basic idea of a Human Rights Charter has been around for a fair while. The general intention is to make a positive statement of human rights that doesn't exist in current law. We have laws that protect people by telling you what you can and cannot do, but we don't have, generally by saying what you can't do, our laws say, but we don't actually have laws that say, you have actually got the right to do these things. So, in theory, this is what a Human Rights Act or Charter is supposed to do. And we are signatories to international treaties on human rights that spell out fundamental human rights. And if a Human Rights Charter wrote those treaties into our legislation, that's kind of the principle of what it's trying to do. Now, the main objection in theory is that it takes power away from our parliament and gives it to our courts. And so you see, not quite the same, but something similar to what you see in America. Congress passes a law, but then it actually is up to the Supreme Court to decide whether that law is constitutional or not. That's the sort of thing that we risk. The potential advantage of it is that it clearly elocutes human rights into our legislation, including human right of religious freedom, which is ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18, which says that everyone should have the right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So there are arguments on both sides for a well-written and balanced human rights charter. However, the Australian Human Rights Commission released a proposal for a human rights charter that was neither balanced nor well-written. Specifically, the AHRC proposal puts a higher emphasis on anti-discrimination rights. That is, no one should be discriminated against based on their race, disability, and sex. And of course, that proposal expands that to uncover sexuality, gender identity, etc. The proposal also downplays the importance of religious freedom, despite the fact that it's listed as one of the core human rights in international treaties. And it even goes as far as to reword the way that it reflects ICCPR 18 to water down religious freedoms. It elevates anti-discrimination to an unassailable position, and if anti-discrimination ever conflicts with religious freedom has to compromise to it in every time. So again, a parliamentary commission looked into this proposal, and we lodged our submission and testified before the committee. And this is another watch this space issue. It is incredibly unlikely the government is going to wade into such a controversial argument so close to an election. But the conversation is not going to go away. And we just need to keep paying attention to what's going on in the conversation, what proposals there are out there. It may be that one of these things is inevitable. It's by no means certain. But if one of these things does come through, we also need to be able to argue for the complete and unedited inclusion of religious freedom and ICCPR 18 into our legislated human rights. Again, a very contested issue. I know there are people in this room who will argue a human rights charter should never, ever, ever happen. Others who think that it may be able to happen. But either way, we have to make sure our religious freedom is protected. The Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill was introduced last year with the stated intention of preventing false information that can cause serious harm. In short, the legislation requires digital providers, websites, Facebook, Twitter, etc., to remove content which is deemed to be misinformation or disinformation. This is why it's called the Mis-Dis Bill. But what is disinformation? According to the law, disinformation is information that is false, misleading, or deceptive, and is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. You can see how broad that is. The content doesn't have to be false. It only has to be deceptive, whatever that means. And it doesn't have to cause harm. It just has to be reasonably likely to contribute to harm. So what is harm? Well, the bill gives a long list of harms, including disruption of public order, the harm to democratic processes or government institutions, health, the environment, economic or financial harm. But the most problematic one is point 1. Hatred against a group on the basis of a range of attributes, including gender, sexual orientation, or religion. The law requires that digital providers have to remove this content, and fines were up to 5% of annual global turnover, which means Facebook is looking at a $120 billion fine for breaking this law. So we put it all together. And Facebook was required to look at a post about something controversial like the biblical definition of marriage and decide whether it is misleading or deceptive, regardless of truth, reasonably likely to contribute to the harm, which is hatred of someone based on their sexuality. And if they fail to remove that, $100 billion is their turnover, $6 billion is their fine. $6 billion fine. So, you're on the board of Facebook. What do you do? Because they have to do it for every post. So they automate it. And they have to make sure they don't get fined. So they put the threshold very, very low. And then instantly, all religious speech about sexuality and gender is instantly blocked. It was terrible legislation. I can't think of an adjective for it. And it suddenly, fortunately, found itself very friendless. And we wrote submissions again and coordinated with denominations and faith groups, and we engaged directly with the government. And again, the government listened. Last November, Communications Minister Michelle Rowland announced that the bill was being withdrawn to be rewritten. Mrs. Rowland explicitly stated that she was going to withdraw the bill, it's going to be rewritten, and there would be religious exemptions. She said, we want to make it as explicit as possible that nothing in this bill can inhibit religious expression. That would be a new area that wasn't considered at the time, but it's clearly important and we want to address it. Okay, we'll take them at their face. Unintended consequences, they were informed of the consequences, they've pulled the bill to work on it. And we haven't heard anything more about the bill. But that's encouraging response from the minister. Again, every opportunity to ram through terrible legislation. Okay, moving on to New South Wales. The Conversion Practices Bill has received a lot of attention. And if you live in New South Wales, you're probably sick of hearing it by now. But it is worth reminding ourselves of how we got here. Leading up to the 2023 New South Wales state election, the independent MP, Alex Greenwich, announced that his condition of support for any government was support for a conversion therapy ban, following the Victorian model. So we helped churches run candidate forums, and over a third of electorates in New South Wales had a church-based candidate forum, and almost every marginal electorate did. We worked with both parties to help them understand our concerns, and as a result, leading into the election, Chris Minns made firm commitments not to ban prayer, preaching, or consensual requests for support. Now, Alex Greenwich introduced his legislation later in 2023, and the Department of Communities and Justice introduced their proposal. Both were carbon copies of Victoria. But we resourced our churches to have meetings with their MP and to encourage their people to write to their MP. And this campaign, encouragingly, was picked up by almost every Christian denomination and a wide range of other faiths as well. And as a result, the government committed to writing their own legislation in consultation with faith leaders. And we fast forward to this year, and the government finally introduces its bill after months of negotiation. Now, it's dramatically better than the Victorian legislation, with explicit protections. But those protections are poorly worded and vague, especially around religious freedom. It's hard to know what's protected and what isn't. You can see a core, you know that's protected. You can see out there, you know it's not. Big grey area of uncertainty in this legislation. So where does this leave us? Well, the legislation doesn't come into effect until April next year. But faith communities, we need to start preparing now. The government have committed to providing detailed guidance about how this legislation will work. And we're currently engaging with them to push them to give this guidance early rather than late, because we need to know what is legal, what is not legal. When we sit down and start going through all those things that John made us think about, first we've got to know if it's legal or not. If I'm a minister and an adult comes to me with unwanted attractions and says, "Will you pray for me?" Am I allowed to do that? Government, you've got to give us an explicit answer, yes or no. Am I allowed to do that? This will give us more certainty, but it will also give us something to take to the next election. And we will be supporting candidate forums for the next New South Wales state election, and we plan to have a lot more of them happening. And if the guidelines that the government provides fully keep Chris Minns's promises, then that is an opportunity for the government to front up in front of the faith communities of Australia and say, we kept our promises. But if they don't, then that's the question that we're going to be asking of them in those things. And we'll give them the opportunity to commit to how they're going to fix it, and we'll give the opposition the opportunity to make their promises to us. Let's see who wants our vote more. Which brings us to the Equality Bill. Also, an innovation from Alex Greenwich, but this time he did not warn us before the election that this one was coming. This is a massive bill, 50 pages long, making over 80 changes to 20 pieces of legislation. And if passed, it would have dramatic negative impact on faith communities, women, and children. Normally, any one of the changes they're trying to make would require a whole bill to itself. But this bill blends all these issues together, and it's almost impossible to split them apart from each other. This means that any discussion is complicated, and it's taken a huge amount of oxygen away from other bills and independent MPs' bills, and a number of them are quite upset. And it's taken oxygen away from the government's agenda. It is impossible to take or leave bits of this bill, or to amend it. It's got to be treated as a whole. The bill was introduced almost exactly a year ago, along with Alex Greenwich's conversion therapy legislation, and it has stalled ever since. As with conversion therapy, we've helped faith leaders to meet with their MP, to write to their MP, and I've spent a long time talking with MPs of all sides, and they keep telling me they're getting the message. They're getting the emails. I've had staffers in MPs' offices saying, we're getting hundreds of these things a week. I know Labor MPs who are completely opposed to the bill, and others who are just commenting, I get so many of these things. In many cases, this is the issue they get the most letters about, full stop. That's during all this housing rezoning issue as well. But we don't know what they're going to do. They might reject the whole bill. They might try to amend it. They might try and cut up bits and pieces of it and see which bits they're going to pass. The latest legislative deadline is August 16. I don't think they're going to make it. In the meantime, we just have to make sure that they keep getting letters. They keep hearing from faith leaders. If you here or on live stream in New South Wales, if you have not yet written to your MP, do so. If your church has not yet met with their MP, make sure that they do so. Don't let them forget how bad this bill is. Okay, still in New South Wales. The government have commissioned the New South Wales Law Reform Commission to do a review of the whole Anti-Discrimination Act. The terms of review are very broad, and they do hold some areas of concern. For instance, you can see the terms, considering the range of attributes protected and the areas of public life opens the door for more things to be considered discrimination and more areas for these things to be considered discrimination in. The phrase must be inclusive and reflect a modern understanding of discrimination. That rings alarm bells. Because often the phrase modern understanding is used to contrast with that old-fashioned religious stuff. Also on the table is vilification, including religious vilification, and disagreement over gender and sexuality, whether sexual harassment should cover other attributes. So we saw that in previous legislation at the federal level. Positive obligations to prevent harassment. This is a tricky space, and we're going to talk about that when we get to Queensland, because depending on how you define harassment, a positive requirement to prevent it can have a very chilling effect on religious speech and freedom. Now, we are very early in this consultative process, and encouragingly, Freedom for Faith were invited to lodge a preliminary submission explaining what we think the Commission should be looking at. So we've been invited to be in the process from the start, and we will continue to be in the process. I suspect this is going to be a major part of what we're looking at for the rest of this year and into 2025. And we'll keep you up to date as soon as I know what's going on. Okay, Queensland. The government recently introduced a complete rewrite of the anti-discrimination legislation. This bill outlined a wide range of categories that would be illegal to discriminate against, including sexuality, sexual activity, and gender identity. And they did allow for discrimination in organisations which had genuine occupational requirements. And the example they had of that was a political party needs to be able to employ somebody who agrees with their political worldview. Wonderful. The bill also had a completely different section for faith-based organisations. This allowed faith-based organisations to prefer to employ people of the same faith with the conditions, as we've seen in other legislation, that it's a genuine occupational requirement and that the discrimination is reasonable and proportionate. These are both very problematic conditions because it means that a court gets to decide what is reasonable and appropriate, what is a genuine occupational requirement in a faith community. Is it reasonable and proportionate to require a teacher in a Christian school to uphold the doctrine of the Trinity? If somebody changes what they believe about Christianity and the school says, one of Mark's schools says, no, we're not employing you anymore, was that reasonable? Was that proportionate? Don't know. We'll wait for the judge to tell us. The bill added further restrictions that weren't laid onto other organisations, particularly this line, to remove any doubt. I love that. It is declared that a person cannot rely on subsection 1 to discriminate against another person on the basis of a protected attribute other than religious belief or religious activity. That means you could employ somebody based on their religious beliefs, but not if those beliefs intersected with another attribute, like gender, sexuality, or even sexual activity. This literally meant that a Jewish school could refuse to eat somebody if they ate pork, but not if they were working as a prostitute. A Christian church could require employees to say that they believed that sex belonged within heterosexual marriage, but could not require them to live it out. A Muslim women's group could refuse to employ a woman who was not wearing a hijab, but not if she was actually biologically a man. It was ridiculous. When the bill was introduced, Freedom for Faith was asked to help out, and we had not done very much in Queensland, but I'd already had some conversations with faith leaders planning for the state election in October. In particular, I'd been talking with Queensland churches together, and David Baker is here with us today. And that's a network that represents a wide range of denominations. Interestingly, when you combine the denominations reflected by Queensland Churches Together and the main affiliates of Freedom for Faith, put together, we actually ended up being almost every Christian denomination in Queensland. And I'm really glad that the General Secretary, David, stand up now, and just, there you go, there's David, General Secretary of Queensland Churches Together, and we've been working extremely closely. If you want to know anything about Queensland, anything, including how to pronounce its electorates, chat with David. So, I chatted with David, and I proposed an approach, modelled on the New South Wales approach, and faith leaders got on board very quickly. We supported a multi-faith submission. We also recommended a letter from faith leaders that was sent to the Premier, signed by 20-odd faith leaders, and copied to every MP. And we quickly spun up a Contact Your MP campaign so that churches could write and individuals could write to their MPs' offices. And 2 months ago, the government withdrew the bill. Was it because of our campaign? Well, when the bill was withdrawn, the proponents of the law went on public and accused the government of giving in to the religious lobby. On this bill, our voice seems to have been heard. In place of the bill, the Queensland Government have now introduced the Respect at Work bill. This legislation is a lot more restrained and is primarily intended to implement the Respect at Work report that came out of the federal process. And it's again supposed to stop sex-based harassment, which is, generally speaking, goals that we can support. However, the devil is in the details. In the section on sex-based discrimination, the definition of sex is expanded to include a sex that the person was or has been changed to. This risks introducing the whole transgender debate into a bill that was intended to stop women from being discriminated against for being women. In addition, the bar is extremely low. The bar is either with the intention of offending or, point two, in circumstances where a reasonable person would have anticipated the possibility that the other person would be offended, humiliated, or intimidated. In the broader discussion of sex and gender and sexuality, positions of belief on both sides can easily be considered to be demeaning of the other side. Some activists have declared misgendering somebody or using their wrong pronouns or dead naming them as inherently demeaning. On the other side, activists define men transitioning into women as inherently demeaning to women. On top of this, on the next slide, the legislation creates a positive duty for organisations to prevent this kind of discrimination and harassment based on sex. So harassment is anything that could be reasonably considered to be demeaning around, and if we add gender into it, what does it mean for an organisation to prevent this kind of harassment as a positive responsibility on the organisation? What sort of speech do they have to silence? What sort of teaching does a Christian school have to stop teaching to support this positive requirement? The second problem with this bill is the vilification section. And it says, a person must not, because of a list of attributes, including gender identity, religion, sex characteristics, or sexual orientation, of another person or a group of persons, engage in a public act that a reasonable person would consider hateful towards, reviling, seriously contemptuous, etc. 3 things to note. The word hateful. It does not mean the same thing as inciting hatred. In fact, as far as I'm aware, there is no legal definition of the word hateful, which then means the courts have to fall back on an ordinary English definition. And the ordinary English definition of hateful can include arouses hate, deserves to be hated, full of or expressing hate, or unpleasant, dislikable, distasteful. Well, what will the court decide a reasonable person considers hateful? On top of this, the definition of a reasonable person is shifted. What a reasonable person is can only include members of the affected category. What an average person or even a judge may find reasonable is irrelevant. Only the offended category gets to decide what is reasonable. If you said something about Christians, would a reasonable Christian find it hateful? In addition, harm doesn't actually have to have occurred. It's enough that a reasonable member of the category would consider the conduct hateful. This is an extraordinarily broad clause, and we have no idea how a judge will rule. This is going to get very, very expensive. Would a reasonable Christian consider a Muslim saying that all Christians are wrong and are going to hell? Would I consider that hateful? Could I pretend that I consider that hateful? What if I was a reasonable evangelical Christian? And then who gets to define the category from which you choose who is reasonable to then choose whether they've been offended? And the third problem with this law is the exemptions. As with all similar laws, there are exemptions for good faith actions, for academic and artistic purposes. But in most similar legislation, that list would also include religious purposes. But it doesn't. Now, many of these problems would go away if we could just get the word hateful out of that legislation and have it as inciting hatred, keep it as a higher bar, and dropping in protection for good faith religious speech. But as it stands, this combination of factors make this legislation incredibly dangerous for freedom of speech, which is exactly what we've said in our parliamentary submission and to the inquiry into this bill, and our second letter to the Premier, and David went to their inquiry and he spoke to their inquiry. Well, the report came out of the inquiry, out of the committee on Friday, and they failed to even reference our submission once. They had made no reference to acknowledging the detailed work that we've done with the heads of faith, asking for clear, precise alterations to the legislation. It's just no indication they even paid attention. In addition, the Premier's letter that I told you about, the Premier passed that letter on to the Attorney General, and we got a reply from the Attorney General saying that the Attorney General was too busy to meet with the heads of faith of Queensland. So this only just happened literally Thursday, Friday last week. So we're still processing and we're still planning our next steps. But I can guarantee you we are not going to go quietly. The churches of Queensland are not as mobilised as the churches of New South Wales. Yet. So we need to work very hard in the next few weeks to call on the government to just to use our quite reasonable adjustments that would allow them to pass the legislation without causing the problems that they were causing. I've got an election coming up in October, which we are planning to run candidate forums in. So this will be an interesting test. South Australia, just quickly, the Greens have announced that they will introduce a bill that will remove exemptions from all faith-based organisations. They say that they will still let ministers be appointed based on religion. Isn't that nice? We haven't seen the bill, but the rhetoric sounds like Queensland model and the equality bill on steroids. It shows the importance of fighting these issues at every state, in every jurisdiction. Because not just for the good of the people of that state, but because these things spread. And next bit of bad legislation is modelled on the previous lot that passed. Conversion therapy keeps getting modelled on Victoria, which is why it is so exciting that we did stop the anti-discrimination bill in Queensland and that we have fought back on conversion therapy in New South Wales. We need to stop the South Australian bill too. And we're already working on our plans for a Contact Your MP campaign in South Australia, and we'll keep you up to date with that. In Western Australia, the Attorney-General has begun work on conversion practices legislation, and comments in the media show that they're working on the process. But there is an election in Western Australia in March next year, and again, we plan to run candidate forums there too. So the closer we get to that election, the less likely it is that they're going to try and pick this fight, but that it will be an open issue for the government in the next election. Either way, we're going to make sure that conversion therapy is a topic in the candidate forums in the election of Western Australia. Which, take a sigh, which brings us now to strategy. Where do we go from here? Last year, I stood up here and I laid out a strategy that we'd been developing. The candidate forums in New South Wales had just been a success, and we were just getting started working on our Contact Your MP system. It was rough and sort of pink, but it was working. And I laid out a vision that, along with our historical strengths of legal analysis and supporting faith leaders, we would help churches mobilise their voice through candidate forums in every state and federal election. And Contact Your MP would be there available, helping people to write to their MP on every major issue. That was the plan then. Today, as we look back at everything that's happened, all the lessons we've learned, nothing has changed. It's really annoying for me because I actually really like the new thing. I like coming up with a new strategy and building the new thing, but the simple reality is this approach is starting to work. When we engage with our local MPs and give them the opportunity to speak back to us, to hear what we're concerned about, when we demonstrate how many of us there are and how concerned we are about these issues, they listen. So the plan is to stay the course and keep getting better at executing these basics. So the last 2 minutes, I'll just talk about two of these strategies. Candidate forums. There are 3 big elections in the next 6 months or so: Queensland, Western Australia, and the federal election. We've also got Northern Territory and ACT, but we're learning that this model doesn't work very well in smaller jurisdictions, so we're still trying to figure out what is going to work. But the federal election, now, it technically could be called any day now, but if I was a betting person, I'd happy to bet my boots on a May election. It is possible that it could land in December, though. So we're preparing for an early election if it does get called. But the hardest part of all these forums is finding the church in each electorate that's keen to host it. The actual event is pretty easy to run. If you can run a church service, you can run one of these events. We've got a full how-to guide. But explaining to the churches what's involved, answering all their questions, talking to membership about how this isn't being political and playing politics, but it's using our godly voice in a godly way to speak into our democratic world. This takes time. Now, we're well down the track in Queensland, and David's been doing an excellent job there, and we're starting work on Western Australia and the federal election. And to help us, I'm excited to say we've just employed a new staff member who will be spending his time talking to churches. But Mark Polonsky, introducing Mark. Mark lives in Queensland, so he cannot be here today. He's just started as our new church relations and support manager. He's got extensive experience in journalism and politics, and for the past 20 years or so has been working for ministry organisations and is experienced in talking to churches and getting them to do things across 3 states. He knows churches. He will be a great asset to us. The other strategy for mobilisation is Contact Your MP. This is a website that walks you through the process of writing to your MP or asking them for a meeting. And the idea is to make it as easy as possible. My favourite phrase is, I can do that. Yeah, I can do that. That looks easy. I can run a church. I can run one of these candidate forums. I can put 5 words together. I could write a short letter to my MP. The system is designed to be modular and quickly rolled out on new issues each time. And we've used it for 4 or 5 campaigns so far. Again, we should have the list in Queensland, New South Wales, and federally. And we're working on campaigns in South Australia and Western Australia. When you saw the site last year it was clunky. It did the job, but it couldn't handle multiple issues, and so we redeveloped it from scratch to a well-designed landing page, search engine, clean and easy to follow how-to guides, and it has been very effective in New South Wales and in Queensland. And we're just embarking on our next redevelopment of the whole system, and we're going to be building it again from the ground up, incorporating everything that we've learnt. So that's our plans. Continued legal analysis and support for faith leaders, and expanded candidate forums and Contact Your MP campaigns. But this does need resources. Freedom for Faith is partly funded by our 5 affiliate denominations, but we're also dependent on donations, especially as we grow in our staff and employ Mark, and as we focus on redeveloping our new Contact Your MP system. We ran a major fundraising campaign leading up to the end of financial year, and praise God, we did raise money and funded Mark for 9 months. But we need to keep funding him. We need to keep fundraising and keep getting support. And I'm sure I'm talking to the converted here. But now's the opportunity to be telling your friends and your churches about what we are doing, the successes that we can have when we help churches to stand up and have their voice, and how they can be involved. We're also keen to talk to other denominations and organisations who would be like to be supporting us. So that's where we're up to today. That's our plans, and that's where we're heading.